Payday hits, and for a brief moment, life makes sense again. The numbers look right. The pressure eases. You breathe a little easier, maybe even convince yourself that things are finally under control. So, you allow something small, nothing reckless, just a quiet reward because apparently surviving the month now qualifies as an achievement. Fair enough. A few days pass. Then somehow the balance starts dropping faster than it should. Not dramatically, just efficiently. You notice it, adjust slightly, and promise yourself that next time will be different. But next time arrives looking suspiciously familiar. Nothing is falling apart. Nothing is obviously wrong. And yet, nothing is actually moving forward either. Which is interesting because if everything is fine, it probably shouldn't feel this repetitive. You're not reckless with money. That would be too easy to fix. You work consistently. Income comes in, bills get paid, and nothing gets ignored long enough to turn into a real problem. You think before spending. Sometimes you even overthink it, just to be safe. You're not out here making dramatic financial mistakes. No impulsive disasters. No "what was I thinking" moments. Just normal decisions, made with a reasonable amount of caution. You might even track your expenses from time to time. Watch a few videos, set small goals, adjust things here and there like someone who clearly has at least a basic idea of what they're doing. And on paper, it all looks responsible. That's the strange part. Because despite doing most things right, the progress feels almost invisible. Not stuck enough to panic, not bad enough to demand urgent change, just slow enough to quietly bother you. You save a little, then something offsets it. You cut back in one area, then loosen up in another. It balances out just enough to keep everything stable. And stability sounds good, until you realize it's been the exact same stability for a very long time. At some point, the gap between effort and results stops being surprising. It just becomes expected. Here's where things stop making intuitive sense. Because logically, doing the right things should lead somewhere. Not overnight, not dramatically, but at least in a direction you can recognize. A slow build, a visible shift, something. Instead, what you get is maintenance. Money comes in, money goes out, and whatever stays never seems to grow into anything meaningful. It just sits there, occasionally increasing, occasionally shrinking, but mostly hovering in the same general area, like it signed a lease. And the system feels balanced. That's the trick. Small rewards feel justified because everything else is under control. A bit of discipline here cancels out a bit of indulgence there. You spend carefully, then compensate just enough to keep your conscience clean. Everything offsets everything, so you're not losing. But you're definitely not gaining either. It creates this perfectly flat line that disguises itself as stability. No chaos, no urgency, no obvious mistake screaming for attention. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because if something was clearly wrong, you could fix it. But this just quietly repeats itself every month, like a system that was never designed to change. At this point, it's tempting to blame discipline, or income, or timing. Something personal, something fixable with a bit more effort. But that's not really what's happening. The issue isn't that you lack control. It's that you're operating inside a structure that quietly resets itself. And it does that very well. Every time money comes in, it triggers a kind of mental reset. The pressure from before fades, just enough to make spending feel reasonable again. Not careless, just justified. Then spending creates relief. Bills handled, small comforts allowed, life feels manageable. And that relief becomes important because it signals that things are working. Which is slightly misleading, because that same relief is what makes the next round of spending feel acceptable. It closes the loop. Income leads to spending leads to relief, and relief quietly gives permission to repeat the cycle. Nothing about this feels random. It actually feels quite natural. That's why it's hard to question. You're not making bad decisions. You're making decisions that fit perfectly within a system designed to maintain itself. Every step makes sense on its own. Every choice feels reasonable in the moment. And that's exactly why nothing changes. The system doesn't break because it's internally consistent. It does what it's supposed to do. It just doesn't do what you expect it to do. So if the problem is the loop, the only useful thing to do is break it down. Not in a complicated way. Just enough to see where it keeps resetting, because once you see the pattern, it becomes a lot harder to pretend it's random. Phase 1. Income arrives. This is the clean slate moment. Money hits your account, and everything before it starts to feel less relevant. The stress from last week? Muted. The small regrets? Also muted. It feels like a reset even if nothing structurally changed. You tell yourself this time will be different. Maybe you'll save more. Maybe you'll plan better. And you probably mean it. But the plan is loose. There's no real friction. No defined boundary. Just intention. And intention, as it turns out, is very easy to negotiate with later. Phase 2. Controlled spending mixed with small rewards. This part looks responsible. Bills get paid first. Essentials are handled. Nothing chaotic, nothing irresponsible. Then the small extras start to appear. A slightly better meal. A convenience you didn't really need but can easily justify. Something that makes the day feel lighter, smoother, more deserved. And individually, these decisions are fine. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't feel like mistakes. They feel like balance. You're not overspending. You're just allowing yourself to enjoy the money you earned, which sounds completely reasonable until you realize this is where the pattern gets reinforced. Money becomes associated with relief, with reward, with the feeling that things are under control. So spending stops being just a transaction. It becomes part of the emotional cycle. Phase 3. Compression and adjustment. Now the balance is lower. Not alarming, just noticeably tighter. This is where behavior shifts. You start paying more attention. Maybe you cut back on small things, delay a purchase, become slightly more disciplined, almost as if you're correcting course. But this discipline is reactive. It's not part of a long-term structure. It's a short-term response to a shrinking number. You're adjusting because you have to, not because the system changed. And that's a key detail. Because as soon as the pressure eases again, so does the discipline. Then the next paycheck arrives. And the entire sequence resets without resistance. Each phase justifies the next. The reset makes spending feel safe. The spending creates relief. The relief makes repetition feel acceptable. And the tightening at the end gives you just enough confidence to believe you're managing things. At no point does the system get interrupted. There's no moment where something forces a different outcome. No friction strong enough to break the sequence. And that's all it takes. The system doesn't need a big mistake to fail. It just needs this pattern to run consistently, which it does. Quietly. Every single month. This loop sounds abstract until you put it into something concrete. Take someone earning $3,000 a month. They decide to save $200. That feels responsible. Structured, like progress is happening. But throughout the month, they spend a little more here and there. Better food on a stressful day. A few extra conveniences. Nothing dramatic. Just small upgrades that make life easier. By the end of the month, about $150 quietly disappears into those small decisions. So technically they saved, but in reality, almost nothing changed. And emotionally, it still feels balanced. That's the problem. Now consider someone who avoids big purchases entirely. No expensive gadgets, no large impulsive decisions. From the outside, they look disciplined, but they constantly optimize for comfort. Subscriptions they barely use. Food delivery instead of cooking. Paying for convenience whenever possible. Each decision feels justified in isolation. Time saved. Effort reduced. Stress avoided. And again, none of it looks like a mistake. But stack them together, and they quietly consume any potential progress. No single decision is the issue. The pattern is. Then you have two people earning the same amount. One of them follows the loop without realizing it. Income comes in, spending follows naturally. Adjustments happen at the end, and the cycle repeats. The other does something slightly different. They separate the idea of reward from the moment income arrives. Not completely, just enough to disrupt the sequence. They create a delay, a bit of friction. At first, the difference is barely noticeable. After a few months, it's still not dramatic. But after a year, something shifts. One person has a system that slowly builds. The other has a system that perfectly maintains. And from the outside, both lives look almost identical. Same income, similar lifestyle, similar decisions, at least on the surface. But underneath, one is creating direction. The other is just repeating it. And that's what makes this cycle difficult to detect. It doesn't look like failure. It looks like a normal, functional life. If this cycle only affected your bank balance, it would already be a problem. But it goes a bit deeper than that. Over time, this pattern starts training your decisions in a very specific way. Money stops being something you control long-term and slowly becomes something you use to manage short-term feelings. Stress goes up, spending relieves it, effort feels heavy, spending softens it. You start associating money less with building and more with stabilizing, not in an obvious way, nothing dramatic, just small, repeated signals that tell your brain, this is what money is for. And the more consistent that signal is, the harder it becomes to delay it. Patience weakens a little. Delayed gratification feels less natural. Waiting starts to feel unnecessary, even when it would clearly help. Because why wait if the system resets anyway? That's when decisions become reactive. You're no longer choosing based on where you want to go. You're choosing based on what feels right in the moment, within a structure that already decided the outcome. And there's another cost, one that doesn't show up immediately. Optionality. When your system constantly resets, it removes any real margin. There's no extra space, no buffer, no flexibility. And without that, opportunities become harder to act on. Not because they don't exist, but because your system isn't built to absorb them. So over time, something subtle happens. Expectations adjust. You stop aiming for growth, not consciously, but because nothing in your current pattern supports it. Stability becomes the default goal, not because it's exciting, but because it's familiar. And familiar systems rarely challenge themselves. So if this feels familiar, here's the part that usually gets misunderstood. This isn't happening because you're bad with money. It's happening because your system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. It loops, cleanly, predictably, almost efficiently, and trying to fix it with more discipline alone is like pressing the gas pedal harder while the car is in neutral. You'll hear more noise. It might feel like effort, but nothing actually moves. The shift comes from breaking the sequence, not perfecting it. That means separating income from immediate reward, creating small delays where the system expects instant relief, adding just enough friction to interrupt the automatic flow. Not extreme changes, not unrealistic restrictions. Just structural adjustments that stop the reset from happening the same way every time. Because if nothing interrupts the cycle, nothing changes. It will keep repeating, quietly, convincingly, indefinitely. But the moment you disrupt the pattern, even slightly, the direction starts to shift. And that's really the goal. Not perfection. Not control over every decision. Just a system that finally moves forward instead of standing still. If this pattern felt a little too familiar, that's probably not a coincidence. Before trying to fix anything, just notice it. The timing, the decisions, the reset. That awareness alone already starts to change how the system behaves. If this helped you see it more clearly, like the video and share it with someone who might be running the same loop. And if you want more breakdowns like this, stay close.